Well, happy to have another opportunity to study with you this morning in the book of Acts. We've been getting Paul finished with his third missionary journey, and he's arrived back in Jerusalem. And so we're beginning a new section in the book of Acts today, starting in Acts chapter 21 and verse 17, with Paul's last visit here to Jerusalem and all the different events that take place that, of course, they're going to lead him to Rome. Before we begin our class, as always, we want to begin with a word of prayer. We'll ask Brother Sheldon to direct our minds. Amen. All righty. So we have Paul's reception by the church. He's carrying that contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem that he's brought from all of those Gentile churches that he's established out there in Asia Minor and in Greece and Macedonia, and that is delivered and received. And then we'll see that Paul's going to try to do away with some false ideas that have been planted in the minds of the Jewish brethren, that Paul is against the Jews keeping their customs and traditions, and that he's anti-law, anti-Moses, I guess. And James gives him a way to try to show people that that's not the case. And then he gets arrested at the temple in the end of the chapter here. So verse 17, and when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. About a 2 days' journey would have brought them, well, that's my note there. I don't know how to put the scripture there. Would have brought them to Jerusalem. And now the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. So Paul comes into Jerusalem from Caesarea, and he's now received there by the church. And it seems to have been a joyous reception. They received us gladly, it says. So Paul had asked the Romans and others to pray that his contribution might prove to be acceptable to the church that he was raising and helping put together with the different congregations among the Gentiles. And it sounds like his prayer was, answered, that they did receive Paul and the messengers of the churches and the contributions that they brought, and were happy to receive him. And it mentions that Paul went in with us to James, Luke says. And James is a prominent figure in the church at Jerusalem. It's James, the Lord's brother. Remember, James the Apostle was beheaded back in chapter 12. So this is another James that is well known among the brethren. Not the apostle, but one regarded as an apostle. He is the Lord's brother. He didn't believe in Jesus, during his ministry, but he saw Jesus raised from the dead. And he, along with his brothers and his mother, they are all there with the disciples after the resurrection of Christ, waiting in Jerusalem for the Holy Spirit to come on the apostles. And they were believers then, and James became a leader in the Jerusalem church, one of the elders. He wrote the book of James. So he is a very prominent person. When Paul came back after his conversion from Damascus, he came to the church, and it was James was one of those that he met with, and he called him a pillar of the church along with Peter, and uses the word apostle as somebody sent by the Lord, not like one of the 12, but he had seen the Lord raised from the dead, and he did have evidently a commission, I guess you could say, given to him to look after the church and preach the gospel. And so he was counted, kind of in the secondary sense as an apostle. And he's mentioned with the elders, but when the elders are mentioned here in Jerusalem, it's usually the one personality that stands out above the others is James that is mentioned. So James is one that has seen the Lord and is a great leader in the church there. Remember in Acts chapter 15 that it was James that was kind of in charge of the meeting they had in Acts 15. He kind of brought the meeting to a close and was the one that sent the letter out from the church to the Gentiles saying they don't have to keep the law of Moses and circumcision, but they recognized them as faithful without that. In verses 19 and 20, And after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. So Paul is received by the church and by James there, and now he goes into a same kind of rehearsal of the leading events that happened on his third missionary journey, all of those conversions and things that we studied about and the establishment of those churches. Tells the brethren there in Jerusalem. So just like we've got the ability to read it in the book of Acts, they got the oral presentation about those things from Paul. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." So that's quite a picture that we get about how many Jewish Christians there were in Jerusalem. It says there were thousands. The word there is myriad. There were tens of thousands. I'd like to have tens of thousands, that are Christians in a city. So you can see there has been an effective work done among many Jewish people that have obeyed the gospel. They're by no means close to the majority, but still there are tens of thousands that have obeyed the gospel. So there has been a great work done by the apostles and the brethren in Judea and throughout the world to try to convert Jewish people also to the gospel faith, that come to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And they are very happy to hear about what happened among the Gentiles. And they glorify God that his graceful gift of salvation has been spread to the Gentiles, and so many of them have obeyed through Paul's ministry. So there's a lot of things to rejoice about when you read this passage about how many souls have been saved among the Gentiles and the Jews. But among these Jewish brethren, he says they're zealous for the law. They grew up under the law of Moses. They are Jewish people, from birth, right? I mean, they have had certain customs of Judaism that they've been following their whole life, and they're still zealous for those things. And so they've gotten the idea from Judaizing teachers that have come to Jerusalem and have told half-truths about Paul, that Paul is just like opposed to you keeping any traditions of Judaism. Why, you shouldn't even circumcise your children, they say Paul says. But that's not true. So James is wanting to try to knock down this prejudice that's there in the minds of Jewish Christians and other Jews that are there in Jerusalem about what Paul actually teaches. And he's going to try to have an object lesson to put down these rumors and half-truths. Anybody else have a thought on this verse so far? Anyone have anything? Again, we're having a class. They're allowed to talk. Verse 21, "And they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs." So doesn't that imply that that is not true? They've been told this false idea about what you're teaching, and come back here to Jerusalem and report it to people. Oh, this Saul of Tarsus or Paul is out there teaching against Moses. Well, Paul believed in Moses, right? When he was with Jews, he became as a Jew. When he was with Gentiles, as a Gentile, so that he might win some from both groups. He was willing to accommodate himself on matters of liberty that aren't a matter of law to all people that he came in contact with, that he could save people. So what they were saying about him was not true, and James is going to come up with a suggestion on how maybe he can put down these rumors. Again, Paul taught obedience to Christ that Moses had talked about, right? That's what he taught. He taught the gospel is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. It is the outcome that Moses was trying to teach people to get ready for Christ. Yes. Well, I don't disagree. That's what he was teaching as far as, and we're going to emphasize this as we go along, that you don't have to keep anything in the law of Moses to save you, right? But Um, Paul was not opposed to Jews circumcising their children. They could go on practicing those customs if they wanted to. As a matter of liberty, you can continue to practice things from the law of Moses as a Jew, but we're saved by Christ. And Gentiles, these things should not be bound on them. And that was the whole controversy in chapter 15. We don't bind the law of Moses as a matter of salvation for people. That is not what saves us. And evidently, they're saying he's teaching Jews that they can't follow Moses or the customs that Moses taught and can't circumcise their children. And that's not what Paul taught Jewish Christians. He didn't tell them that. He told, no, you can't bind this on Gentiles. It's not a part of salvation. Yes. Right. So Paul did teach that it was unnecessary to salvation. It says whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised, it means nothing. But he didn't say you can't do it. And he himself had Timothy circumcised, so he'd be useful to him as he took him on that first missionary journey. People among the Jews knew that his father was a Greek. But with Titus, since he was a Gentile and people were wanting him to be circumcised, Paul absolutely refused, right? He said that's a matter of faith. That is not binding on Gentiles, and it's not something that should be bound on anybody as a matter of salvation. So there is that distinction that it obviously caused trouble in the early church, but it's a distinction we need to try to be able to see, a difference in doing something as just you can take it or leave it, right? And if you want to follow it, you can do it, and something that is necessary for salvation. Paul wouldn't stand for that. And that's not what James is standing for either. Yes. Right, absolutely. There's just, like you say, there's customs and things that are it's just a matter of judgment or in liberty whether you practice it or don't practice it. What we want to emphasize, and you take your stand on, is things that are a matter of faith and salvation. And the things that aren't, live and let live. Let people exercise their own judgment. Yeah. We don't, to say that the law is not in effect as far as our law for salvation doesn't mean we don't love those scriptures, that we're not encouraged to read those scriptures, and that Moses, we don't forsake Moses in the sense that we don't pay any attention to what he had to say. He was pointing to Christ. So we do study it. We get encouragement from those scriptures back there to believe in Jesus. They're a tutor to lead us to Christ. But we're not under that tutor in the sense that it's our law today. No. And Peter's, an apostle to the Jews, and you read 1st and 2nd Peter, he's teaching the same thing as Paul about salvation. It's the same. James is wanting Paul to make it clear that as a custom, that it was all right to practice those things. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. So you have all of these tens of thousands of Jewish Christians that are there that have heard these misrepresentations about what Paul was teaching. They're all going to hear Paul's there. It's going to be big news that the Apostle Paul has come to Jerusalem. And, well, does he really have anti-Moses teaching? Is he really against the customs that Jewish people would practice? And he proposes a visual act to convince these brethren that were zealous for the law that they were misinformed about those things. In verse 23 and 24, therefore do this that we tell you. So this is we as the elders there, I guess. James and the elders. We have 4 men who were under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses in order that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. So it says, you take these men that have taken a vow, and they became unclean during the period of the vow, so now they have to go repurify themselves to complete their vow. And so James says, go with them as their representative and pay their expenses for them. And then when they're purified, you'll be associated with that, and it'll show you're not hostile to these Jewish customs of taking vows and what you do under a vow. Of course, we saw Paul under a vow at Corinth, and he cut his hair there because he was under a vow. So he had been practicing that before. So that's not different. If you were going to be at the temple and be working there at that time while the temple still stood, then there were certain ceremonies you had to go through at the temple if you were going to be there. So Paul, as a Jew, didn't see anything wrong with them practicing those customs. Now, it's not going to be too long till that temple is going to be destroyed. And that whole system is going to be gone. There's not going to be any of those ceremonies left. That's not even an issue for us today because that's gone. But there was a period of time between 30 A.D. and 70 A.D. where you had this situation. And you see that Paul is willing to go along with James' suggestion. He's not able to complete it because of the prejudice of the Jews. They're going to arrest him in the temple and charge him falsely. It doesn't work out. But he's trying to go along with the program. They're trying to try to bring about unity or do away with their false ideas that they have about what he's been teaching. So he's going to go and announce these men's vow to the priests and pay their expenses, and then they'll have a period of time of 7 days that they have to, abstain from different things under a Nazirite vow that they would do. And then at the end of that 7 days, they would offer sacrifices, 2 doves or pigeons, or a lamb would be offered to restore them back to their ordinary course of life and purify them to be associated with other people. And so Paul is showing that he had respect for their customs that they were practicing among the Jews. And again, Christ is the fulfillment of the law, and keeping the law of Moses doesn't have anything to do with salvation, Paul would teach. But the customs, he's perfectly willing, as long as you don't make them a matter of salvation, he would go along with them. So, again, he said, to the Jews I become a Jew, that I might win some among the Jews. He would do that. Yes. Well, we know there's no separate priesthood in the church, so they didn't have any special garments or special distinction. We were all brothers and sisters when they worshiped. There wasn't any hierarchy there. And they didn't have, there's no mention of incense. What we offer up is prayer. We have a spiritual worship instead of a physical worship. They had different compartments there at the temple. You know, they had those porticos that went all around, and separate rooms that were under that portico that you could meet in. So, yeah. Yes. Right. Well, that's what we're talking about here, is the custom. They weren't looking at these things as matters that brought forgiveness of sins, that brought salvation to your soul, but they had certain ceremonies that they were still keeping just as part of the social custom of the time. Yeah, I'm getting them. That's fine. That's what. So, again, this is all, you have this transition period where you still have the temple standing and some of these customs going on, that God's going to put a total end to it. There's not going to be any option to go up and do any of these things at the end of a vow or whatever, because there's not going to be a temple there or anything. It's all gone. And this is written, this is about 58 or something like that. So you got like 12 years. There's not going to be any more temple in just a little while. The Hebrew writer, which I think is Paul, he's telling you, go out of the city, because this is not a lasting city. You've got to make a break with this, for good, because it's not. So again, we're kind of in the part that we can get out of all of this for us is that there are things that are just matters of custom and expediency, that aren't a matter of right and wrong, and those things aren't to be bound, right? Well, no. in those things we have charity and liberty and love for each other, and you do your thing and I'll do mine. In matters of the faith, those matters of commandments and so on, now we got to agree on those, right? We got to all practice the same thing, be of one mind on those things. But on matters of custom and these general things, there's a lot of latitude. Says, but concerning the Gentiles, James wants to make clear, he's not trying to bind the law of Moses on people for salvation. That's not what he's getting at. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what is strangled and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So James and the elders say, oh, don't get us wrong. We're not trying to bind the law of Moses on anybody. Or tell these Gentiles that we agree with what the Holy Spirit decided back there in Acts 15. We're still standing with that. These things are not matters of salvation. They're matters of liberty. And we're just trying to let the Jews know you agree with that part, that it is a matter of liberty. And so Paul goes along with it. He goes, since he is not under a vow, he's not unclean ceremonially, he could go inform the priests of what was going on and speak for the others. The others were unclean. They couldn't go talk to him. So they have Paul as their representative. And they go through this whole process, and they are reaching the end of it, of the 7 days, and then Paul runs into big problems in the temple. And that's verse 27 is where you had the beginning then of this riot that ends up with Paul being imprisoned for several years and having to go to Rome as a prisoner. It all starts here in verse 27. And when the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the multitude and laid hands on him. So Paul is going about his business at the temple. He's not violating any rules of the temple. He's following all the rules. And these people that recognize him from Ephesus, Jews from all over the world had come for Pentecost. And there were a lot of them that had seen Paul in the synagogue preach there. He'd spent several years in Ephesus, and they knew Paul was teaching the gospel. And he had come to the city, and they'd seen him earlier in the week with Trophimus, who was a Gentile from Ephesus. And they just jumped to the conclusion, Paul has brought these Gentiles in the temple, which he hadn't done. And that's what the whole trial is going to be about as we go along. They're trying to prove that he's this terrible person that defiled the temple. But they saw Trophimus earlier in the week, and they just assumed that Paul brought him in. And so they're never able to bring any evidence, really, against Paul. But that's what they're shouting about. They see Paul, he's their enemy, and they want to do away with him. So they began hollering when they see him in the temple and stir up the multitude to say he's defiled the temple, and he's a criminal that needs to be arrested. And they lay hands on him there in the temple. They were crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought a Greek into the temple and has defiled this holy place." And they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Well, there's nothing he wouldn't do. He loves these Gentiles so much. You can just hear he's against our Jewish faith and so on in teaching you're saved under the gospel. And you can see how they're twisting what Paul actually taught and did. They accuse him here of being against the temple and defiling the temple. It's a similar charge that they had made back in chapter 7 and chapter 6 and 7 against Stephen. Same kind of charges were brought against Stephen, that was against the temple. And now they say he's polluted the temple. They had a barrier inside the temple that was set up around the outside of the temple that was to separate Jews and Gentiles, and the courts that you could go in. There's a court of the Gentiles, a big court that people from all nations could come to the temple and worship. But to go inside that wall, that separation, that wall of partition, you had to be a Jew. You had to be an Israelite. And no Gentile was permitted beyond that line. Even those that had accepted the Jewish religion, they weren't allowed to go in. So no man, this is an inscription that the archaeologists have found in Jerusalem that was on that wall and those gates that led into the inner part of the temple. It says, no man or alien race is to enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to blame for the penalty of death that follows. And on this case, the Romans would allow you to execute a person. If you took a Gentile in the temple, you could be put to death by the Jews. And so that's what they're accusing him of. They're accusing him of something guilty of death, but they don't have any proof. Trophimus isn't there with him. They're just assuming that happened. And so you can see why his case would probably be thrown out once it got to Rome. There's no, where are the witnesses? Nobody shows up. Anyway, that was our second bell, so we'll have to stop there. So we'll come back and look at this riot and look at the temple and so on next time, Lord willing. Appreciate your comments.